Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. I am making a Christmas jam today, and I thought I would bring you along, partly just because this is a fun recipe to give as gifts, but partly because I wanted to show you how you can go about taking a standard recipe for a jam and converting it to a lower sugar recipe. And the key here is that we are going to do this by converting things to weight, because you need to know and work in percentages and weight rather than volume when you're doing something like this. And I have a small commercial kitchen. We're actually up in my small commercial kitchen right now, just because this is where a lot of my tools were, and so it was easy for me to do this up here. And I have been buying pectin in bulk. And when I originally started, I started with recipes that were the Sure Jell lower sugar pectin recipes that were inside the box. And then over time, I learned how to convert those volume recipes into weight, and then from there into percentages. And then I started buying pectin in bulk from Pacific Pectin, and because I was doing a lot of volume, and so buying individual boxes was not very price effective. And one of the things that I learned from Pacific Pectin and their input was basically how to figure out and convert recipes so that you could, pretty much for any recipe, you could use their pectin for any size. So what I'm going to do is, this recipe was found online. I'll show you where it originally came from. This is a safe recipe simply because it is cranberries and strawberries, and both of those are highly acidic foods. And so even though this isn't officially a BAL recipe or a National Center for Home Food Preservation recipe, the ingredients in this are very high in acid, and so they are going to naturally be preservation stable and not grow anything nasty. And then we're just going to treat this like we do a standard jam. So we're going to fill to the headspace of a standard jam, and we're going to process for a time that's a standard jam, even though I'm not sure where this original recipe came from and if it's ever been tested by a testing authority. To start off, I'm going to double this recipe. So it calls for 16 ounces of strawberries, and I am going to use 32 ounces because I'm going to do double that. This is the pot that I'm going to be cooking in, and so I'm just going to go ahead and weigh out 32 ounces of strawberries. These were previously frozen from earlier in the year, and unfortunately my bag is slightly holy, and so it's dripping. And this is actually 48 ounces of strawberries, because I had measured this out for a different recipe that I was making commercially. And so I'm not going to need everything here, but I'm going to use most of this. My hands are very clean. And I'll just use the rest of these in smoothies. All right, so there are 32 ounces of strawberries. And then I also need 2 bags. And a typical bag of cranberries is 12 ounces. I'm going to need 2 bags of cranberries, so that's 24 ounces of cranberries. And so if you're working with a recipe and you're trying to figure out, how do I go from volume to weight? The original recipe, as this was written, called for 2 cups of strawberries. And 2 cups is a pint, and a pint is a pound. And so roughly 2 cups of strawberries should be about a pound of strawberries. And so that's the conversion that I did. It's not going to be exact, because if you're using fresh strawberries, even though they might be crushed and pushed down, there's going to be some air in the fruit, and there's going to be a little bit of air around the fruit. But if you are converting from volume to weight, it's going to be close. It's not going to be exact. If we were to measure out 2 cups of strawberries, it would probably weigh slightly less than a pound, but we're just going to use a pound because it makes the conversion easy, and it's probably, 5 to 10% off. And thankfully, this pectin is quite forgiving, and so I can be, slightly one way or the other, and it's still going to set, it's still going to gel, and it's still going to be perfectly safe. So we're not going to worry about that. That's how I go from converting volume into weight units. So 2 cups is 16 ounces, which is a pint. So all of those are the same equivalent measurements. And so I just measured out 4 cups because I'm doubling the recipe, so 32 ounces. I need to chop these cranberries. And I have my strawberries on the stove, but there is no heat right now because we do not want to add heat until we add the pectin. In this particular case, the way this low sugar pectin works, it needs to be mixed into the fruit before it's heated. If you mix it in when the fruit is hot, it will tend to clump up. And so we want our mixture to be cold when we add the pectin in. All right, I'm gonna keep talking while we're grinding up these cranberries, and most of these will probably just blow out from the heat. If you've ever cooked cranberry sauce from scratch, you know that you add a little bit of heat and they tend to break up. But I'm gonna chop them just because I don't want really big chunks in my jam. And I'm not gonna worry that every single one of these is chopped because I like a little bit of chunkiness in my jam, but I want most of these to be chopped. Okay, so I have in this pot, remember this is double the regular recipe, I have 32 ounces of strawberries, and I now have 24 ounces of cranberries. So 32 and 24 is 56 total ounces of fruit going into this. And then it also calls for a little bit of orange and orange zest. I'm not gonna bother factoring that into my numbers. I'm just gonna fudge it a little bit because it's not gonna take up a lot of room, that orange. And so I'm gonna start with my number of 56 ounces. Now, how much sugar do I know I need to add here? Again, we're working in percentages. And so for the sugar, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take 56 ounces, which is the total weight of all of our fruit in this recipe, and I'm gonna divide that by 0.55, because what I want is 55% of this recipe to be fruit. So I've got 56 ounces of fruit, and I divide by 0.55 to get the total volume of my jam. Now, if you are like me and math is not your super strong suit, this may not be intuitive. It was not intuitive for me. Like, I was the kind of person who would memorize stuff for a test, and I could do the math problems. If you showed me how to do them, I could do them right after you and get them right. But I had no real conceptual understanding of what was actually happening and why things worked. I just knew that when they gave me X, I did Y. And so what you're actually doing there is you want your total volume of jam to be 55% fruit. And that is why you are dividing your total weight of fruit by 55, by 0.55. That's gonna give you a total volume where the volume of the fruit in the total volume is 55%. And that is what the starting point is that Pacific Pectin recommends for their low sugar pectin. Fruit has varying amounts of pectin in it. It depends on what you're using. Cranberries have a lot of pectin. They thicken up pretty much on their own with no pectin at all. Strawberries have virtually none. They are very, very low pectin. And so I figured I'll just start with the standard, and if it has a really super strong set, I'll make a note of it, and if I ever make this again, I'll back off on the pectin amount a little bit. But what we want is 55% fruit, and then we want 3% of the low sugar pectin in our recipe. So if we do that 56 divided by 0.55, we get a total of 102 ounces for our total volume of our jam. Then we multiply 102 ounces by 3%, and we get 3 ounces that we need, give or take, I'm rounding here. But we get 3 ounces of low sugar pectin, and that leaves us with 42 ounces left over that is the sugar. So we are at a 42% sugar in this recipe. So that works out to a total of about 43 ounces. And again, the nice thing about this is you can, once you've got your recipe converted to weight and percentages, we could decide to make a triple batch here as long as it would fit in the pot and not scorch on the bottom. We could say we only have a tiny bit of strawberries left and we want to make 3 jars. We could figure that out. The nice thing about this is once you have things converted from volume to weight, you can ramp up or ramp down your recipe pretty easily. It's very, very handy in that sense because we're working in percentages instead of working by volume. You may have heard that you should not double your recipe for jam. That is somewhat true if you're doing a traditional jam that's a lot of sugar and you're cooking it down to the gel point and testing it in various ways, either with a thermometer or putting it on a cold plate, or basically you're making candy, it can be hard to double that kind of a recipe, because part of what you're counting on is for some of that volume of liquid in that recipe to simply boil off. And it can take a much, much longer time for things to boil off if you are doubling the recipe, because you've got now twice as much volume with the same amount of airspace. And then what happens is things tend to get overcooked, they tend to get scorched. So that's why they tell you not to like double or triple standard jam recipes, because it will fail. I have never had this low sugar pectin fail to set a jam. So it works very, very well, even when I have gone up to doing 18 jars at a time, which was my standard recipe in the commercial recipes that I was doing. So I also need to segment and use the inner part of this orange. And honestly, I think I could probably just juice it, but just because I'm talking, I'm gonna go ahead and peel these and segment them out. So this original recipe called for what would have been 8 cups of sugar, which is 56 ounces of sugar. And we are gonna use 43 ounces of sugar. So we are reducing the sugar in this recipe. We're not reducing it in a huge, huge way. If you really want almost no sugar or no sugar and you wanna use artificial sweeteners in your recipes, I highly recommend Pomona's pectin. Pomona's pectin is a different way of setting, and it will actually not set if you add too much sugar. It has a calcium water. It's a 2-part system, and the calcium water is what sets the jam. So it's a very different chemistry from standard pectins. And so I'm not gonna go into that. But we've gone from, and I'll put on the screen here, I don't have the math in front of me, how much of a reduction this is if we go from 56 ounces to 43 ounces of sugar in this recipe. But we are definitely reducing it. And cranberries are pretty tart. They're virtually impossible to eat if they're raw. And so we definitely need some sugar in this recipe. This is not a recipe that you would want to have no sugar at all, or very, very low sugar. Does that make sense? The math of this is not, if you're not a math person, it's not super intuitive, but trust the process. I will put all of the numbers on the screen so that you guys can see how it worked. But converting to from volume to weight is the first key, and very, very important to this process. You know, I shouldn't have peeled this. I should have just done it like a grapefruit. So I am gonna put some orange segments in this. They're not gonna contribute a ton of flavor, but I do love the flavor of cranberry and orange, so we're gonna go ahead and do that as well. I did this really awkwardly, so I'm gonna show you how I should have done this. I don't know why my brain is not working because I'm talking at the same time. Generally, how you segment citrus is you cut the rind off, trying to leave as much of the fruit as possible. And this is a nice sharp chef knife. I recently sharpened this. So now I have a peeled orange. And now what I want to do is just cut each segment like that and pop it out. That's what I should have done with the other one. It's been a while since I've done this and I kind of forgot that's what I needed to do. And a little bit of membrane from in between on this fruit is not going to hurt anything in this recipe. It's going to be kind of chunky anyway with all the cranberry that's in there. Okay, so we've got our strawberries, our cranberries, our orange zest, our orange segments, and this must be a Cara orange. I wasn't paying attention when I bought it. And these are gonna completely fall apart for the most part in this recipe, so I'm not worried about the fact that they're a little chunky right now. And then these are just the membranes. I'm gonna give these a squeeze, see if I can get any extra juice out of there. And the original recipe calls for a half a cup of water, which would be a full cup of water for this. I don't think I'm gonna need it because the strawberries had been frozen and then had released a ton of juice. And so usually when you're adding water to something like this, it's to keep it from burning before it starts releasing its juices. And cranberries are quite dry. But because the strawberries are in there and they were super juicy and runny, and then the oranges are juicy, I don't think I'm gonna need that water. This is the pectin, and because I'm doubling the recipe, it's 3 ounces. And to this, I'm gonna add another 3 ounces of sugar. This is the total amount of sugar that I need for this recipe, which is 43 ounces. And I'm gonna take 3 of those ounces. And there's really no reason to be this precise other than the fact that I just have done this 100 times for commercial reasons, and so I'm used to doing it this way. But I'm gonna add 3 ounces to this. You can just eyeball this, it doesn't have to be exact. I'm gonna give this a stir. My sugar got a little bit of juice in it, so ignore the chunks that are in there, those will dissolve in a minute. So that the pectin and the sugar is mixed. And what this is gonna do is just give a little bit of space between that pectin. The sugar is gonna act as kind of interference, and it's just gonna keep it from clumping. So it's just gonna it's gonna help it stay evenly mixed and not clumped up as we start to heat this. So everything is cold. I'm adding this cold. Different pectins, different rules. This particular one, you need to add everything together cold. I'm now gonna turn my heat on. And I'm gonna stir everything in well so that it's nicely dissolved. And then while this is heating up, I'm gonna add my spices. And this recipe has cloves, cinnamon, and allspice because it is a Christmas jam. There is also a recipe in the ball book that's a pear, cranberry, orange, if I remember right. I'll take a picture of it and put it up on the screen. That's another really good Christmas jam. That one is a tested ball recipe, and I did do that last year for Christmas gifts. So jam is kind of my thing. All right, and because I'm doubling this recipe, I'm doing a ½ teaspoon each of cinnamon, clove, and allspice. You could do whatever spices you wanted to use. I wouldn't go more than what's called for in the recipe in terms of volume because it'll be overwhelming. But, you know, maybe you want to use some nutmeg. Maybe you want to use some cardamom. You can change out the different spices, or if you don't want spice in there, you can just leave it out altogether. Whatever you want to do. The spices are in there for flavor, not for any kind of safety. So now we're going to bring this up to a rolling boil. So that's a boil that cannot be stirred down. And then we're gonna add sugar and bring it back up to a rolling boil for about a minute. And that's gonna take a little bit of time. I already have my canning pot full of water and heating, so it's hot. So we're ready to go when this is ready to go. The nice thing about being able to do jams this way is, especially if you write things down and keep notes, you may make this and you may say that it's not quite what you wanted. You found the cinnamon to be too overwhelming, or it was still too sweet and you wanted it more tart. So now you're working in percentages. You know that it's 42% sugar. Maybe you want to take it down to 35% sugar. You can try that. So the nice thing about doing this kind of stuff is it's very easy to very systematically decide that you want something at a different place the next time you make it, and if you keep good notes, and so that's the key. But it is a very powerful tool to be able to reduce sugar in a recipe that doesn't call for a low sugar pectin and a reduced sugar jam. The other thing I like about low sugar pectins is you're not cooking the fruit for as long because you're not trying to reach a gel point, which is when you've cooked off enough of the water in the recipe that basically things are going to turn into candy. And that takes a long time. So traditional jam recipes, if you're just not using pectin and you're just cooking down until you reach a gel point, it takes a very long time to do that. And you have to stand there and stir the pot for the entire time, like easily a half an hour, if not longer, to reach that point. The fruit is going to taste way less cooked with this type of a recipe, because we're not going to cook it for nearly as long. You know, once it comes up to a boil and we add the sugar and we bring it back to a boil, that whole thing is probably going to take 5 minutes maybe. And so I think you get a much fresher fruit flavor if you use a pectin rather than using the traditional cooking method. If you're using traditional jam methods, it's actually a science that is, and I'll put this, I've used this infographic so many times at this point in videos, it's kind of funny at this point. But it is very much a chemical reaction that is going on between the natural pectin that's in the fruit. And again, some fruits have a lot of natural pectin and some fruits have virtually zero. So it depends on what kind of fruit you're using. And the acid that's in the fruit. So the pH of the fruit is also important. And then the sugar, and those three things are interacting and they're creating, you know, a lace or a network that's causing that fruit jam to turn into jam and to be thick. And so the pectin circumnavigates that so that you basically, it's like a cheat code. And some people think that somehow using pectin is cheating and that it's unnatural. Pectin is derived usually from citrus rinds. And so it's a relatively natural product. Yes, it's processed for sure. And there's usually a little bit of weird sugar like dextrose or something like that in the package to keep it from clumping while it's in storage. But I personally don't have any issue with pectin instead of not using it. If the trade-off is I don't have a jam that is so sweet that it makes my fillings hurt, I think it's a worthy trade-off personally, but that's just me. And again, Pomona's pectin, if you want to do super low sugar or no sugar jams, that's what you want instead. All right, I'm going to keep stirring this. I'll bring you guys back when this is at a rolling boil. All right, we have returned to a boil. We're pretty close to continuing to boil while we're being stirred. Probably needs just a little bit longer. And you can see how these orange pieces have mostly just fallen apart at this point. And that's what I expected and what it's supposed to do. This big pot, by the way, this would probably be too big if I was just making a standard 6.5 cup recipe. But this is what I use for my bigger batches. And so it's nice because it a lot of surface area, things come to boil pretty quickly. But you would do this in just a standard pot if you were only doing the regular sized recipe and not doubling it. Some of these little cranberries that are still whole, I'm just going to press some of them up against the sides here. This is going to be a pretty seedy jam because there's the seeds from the strawberries and all of the seeds from the cranberries as well. This is going to be interesting. Usually when I make jams that are combinations of fruit, I tend to do things that are in season at the same time. And so, you know, I might do apricots and strawberries or apricots and blackberries, but it's, you know, strawberries are very much an early season June fruit and cranberries are very much a fall thing. And so it's interesting to do this. You would almost have to do this with frozen strawberries because if you were buying fresh strawberries, they would be coming out of the southern hemisphere this time of year, and they would probably taste like absolute cardboard. So if you're going to make this, I highly recommend you use frozen strawberries rather than fresh strawberries. All right, we are at a boil where it continues to boil even though I'm stirring. So we're going to add the rest of our sugar. So this is 40 ounces of sugar, and I like to, rather than dump it all in, I like to stir it as I'm pouring so that I don't get a big giant clump, because if you just dump it in at once, you tend to get a big wad that you have to then keep messing with in order to get it to break up. So I like to stir as I'm going here. There are some chunky bits in here that will dissolve as we go. Adding this sugar is going to drastically reduce our temperature, and it's also going to raise our boiling point when it dissolves. And so you'll notice your nice rapid boil that you had going is immediately going to stop, and it's going to take a little bit to come back up. Notice how glossy that is. I love, this is my favorite part of jam making, is this transformation when you add the sugar and it goes from looking like boiling fruit to looking like jewels. I love this bit. All right, we're gonna keep stirring, bring that back to a boil. I'll bring you back in a minute. All right, we're almost ready. And I did some calculations. A cup of sugar is 7 ounces. And we went from, if we had done the original recipe as written, it was 56 ounces of sugar, and we went down to 43. So that's 13 ounces reduction. That comes out to almost 2 cups less sugar in this recipe than what the original recipe called for. And that comes out to some places between 23 and 24% reduction in sugar. The cranberries are tart. The orange in this is fairly tart. So we could have probably reduced it more than that if we wanted to, but I was going to err on the side of sweeter. You know, typically when I'm making cranberry sauce, I use 3/4 cup of sugar to a 12-ounce bag of cranberries. And obviously a jam is going to be sweeter than a cranberry sauce. So, you know, there's some little kind of hold your finger in the air and see which way the wind's blowing kind of guesstimates here, but that kind of gives you an idea of how I ended up where I did. This should be nice and thick. I don't think we're going to have any problem with this gelling. It has a very nice, you definitely get the tartness of the cranberries. Nice flavor. I don't get a lot of the spice, it's subtle, which is good. So we're waiting for this to come back to a full rolling boil before we can it. I'm gonna get my jars ready over here. Oh, we're almost there. This smells so good, you guys. So according to the USDA, the formal definition for a jam, it needs to be, I think it's 55% sugar is the actual technical definition. So a lot of sugar in a traditional jam. Technically what I'm making is not a jam. If I'm trying to sell it with the USDA definition, it is a fruit spread because it doesn't have the amount of sugar that a traditional jam would have in it. But I mean, imagine if we had flipped those ratios in terms of our fruit and our sugar, and we had done 55% sugar instead of 42% sugar. That's a lot of sugar. I made jam for years and sold it at farmer's market, and I called it jam even though technically, officially, it was a fruit spread. And I just always expected somebody to eventually catch on from one of the licensing authorities and make me change the name, and they never did. So I just called it jam, even though it was technically, according to the guidelines from the feds, not a jam. And I don't make jam for sale anymore. I was never able to get into a commercial kitchen to do it, and it just wasn't economically, it didn't pay off to do it in 18-jar batches, which was about as big as I could go in a small little kitchen like this. All right, I think we're there. So we've reached a boil where it doesn't stop boiling when I stop stirring, which is what you want to see. So we're ready to go in the jars. I'm going to turn my heat off because I don't want it to continue to cook. There is a process where you can overcook stuff and it basically denatures the pectin so that it's no longer able to set your fruit. So you don't want to just keep boiling it. I'm using a ladle from a restaurant supply company that is 8 ounces. I'll still have to go back and adjust, but it saves a lot of time if your ladle is pretty close to the jar size you need. And then I am stirring and pulling kind of straight up, just in case there's some fruit that's floating or separating. I want to make sure I get both fruit and juice in the jar and not end up with some that are super heavy with fruit and others that are mostly juice. So I'm trying to stir and mix as I go here. You can probably hear my canner coming back up to temperature here. It's starting to boil. And I like to go through, this recipe said it made 6.5 cups, which should be 13 cups if I'm doubling it. That number can vary a lot based on how much you boiled it, how juicy your fruit was. Different things are going to affect that. Don't freak out if your measurements don't come out to what it says it is. And in fact, with the ball recipes, I think I've probably had one recipe out of everything I've ever made from them that came out exactly the way it was written in terms of number of jars. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. They call it canning math. But because this is acidic fruit, it is going to be safe even if we get fewer or more jars than what it called for. I like these little almost square jars. These are Anchor Hocking from Walmart. This doesn't look like I'm going to get 13 jars. I like to go through, fill everything almost all the way, and then I go back through and adjust so that I kind of have an idea of how many jars I'm going to need. I don't have to make a ton of adjustments. And we want a 1/4 inch headspace here, so that's pretty tight. We're going to go almost to the top. And you can measure this. There are tools. That one's a little too full. There are tools where you can measure. I've been doing this long enough. I have a pretty good visual on it. And headspace is important, but you know, if you're off by 1/8 of an inch, the world is not going to end, so don't sweat that. The other thing, a lot of times the reasons you won't come out exactly is, you know, it calls for 16 ounces or 2 cups of strawberries, but how you cut those up is maybe different from how I cut them up. And so, like, how much you're gonna get versus how much I'm gonna get in a cup is gonna vary. Yeah, see, that's already got a nice, you can see that's set pretty well. And then when I have little dregs left over, which I do in this case, I will often just scrape it all into a jar and throw it in my fridge and not actually process it, because it's not going to be a full jar. You don't want to process partial jars because the headspace is going to be way off. All right, kids, don't try this at home. All right, let me show you what I got here. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then probably 10 1/4. We got a partial there. So it did not make 13. And if this was supposed to make 6 1/2 per, we definitely didn't get the full amount. But again, my cranberries could have been drier. Maybe the conversion from volume to weight change things, but everything's nicely thick. So I'm gonna wipe rims and put lids on, and I'll bring you back as I'm putting them in the canner. Our pot is just starting to boil. Lids on the jars. I'm probably gonna have to double stack these. I have 2 canners. This one is smaller. If I hadn't been lazy, I would have brought my other one up. So I got 7 plus 1 in the middle. This is my handy dandy silicone Lazy Susan when I need to double stack. So 1 there, 1 here. I'm gonna have to add a lot more water, obviously. And I'm gonna use as hot a water as I can get out of my tap so that I don't shock everything. And then I'll bring you back when everything's ready to start the timer. You can see that our pot has come up to a full rolling boil. We're gonna start a timer for 10 minutes. All right, our timer is done. For most canning recipes, you should probably let this sit in the canner for 5 minutes. It helps with the seal. But honestly, on a jam, and with this short of a processing time, not usually an issue. So I'm gonna go ahead and take these out of here. There's also lots of debate about, is it okay to tip your jars to get the water off? The official Word is no, you're not supposed to do that because the hot jam or whatever it is you're canning can come into contact with that lid when that lid has not completely set, and you potentially can compromise your seal. At least I think that's the logic of why they tell you not to tip it. But I gotta say, I've been canning for more than 20 years, and I don't believe I have ever lost a seal because I tipped my jars. And I tip them off. They say that, you can see I've still got a little bit of water on there. That'll evaporate. And they say not to tip them and the water will just evaporate off. But I have very hard water. And if I don't pour off most of that water, I'm just gonna get huge water stains, even though I have some vinegar in this pot to help with that. And so I tip my jars. And I don't think it compromises my seal. But you do you. Your kitchen, your rules. We're getting some pops. These are Anchor Hocking lids, which I am not that familiar with, so I am happy to hear them pop, because I don't imagine they're super high quality, although Anchor Hocking isn't a terrible brand. It's not like some random thing I've never heard of. Anyway, so here is our 10 jars of Christmas jam. I'm just gonna let these cool on the counter overnight. That is another thing you'll hear, and I've had people mention in comments on other canning posts. You're supposed to put a towel down because the idea is that there's gonna be thermal shock between the temperature of the counter and the temperature of the jar, and you could potentially break the jar just because of the temperature differential. So you put it on a towel instead. These are Formica. This is particle board. It's not like marble. They're not dramatically cold. And again, 20 years of canning, pretty much never put a towel down. I've never, ever broken a jar coming out of the canner. I've broken jars in the canner for a variety of reasons, but I've never had one break after it came out of the canner. So, woo, there we go. I think I got that on camera. So I don't really think that that is terribly necessary as well. Your mileage may vary, particularly if you have stone countertops, which I do not. But here's our jam. I'll bring you back in the morning and we'll sample that little bit that was in that partial jar. And I'll show you what they look like when they're finished. I have some nice stickers that I put on these when they're gifts.
So this is the next morning. We decided to have some of this for breakfast. The flavor on this is fantastic, you guys. I'm not a big lover of just strawberry jam by itself, but combined with the cranberries and that little bit of orange, which definitely comes through, it's really nice. It's sweet, it's tart, it's a little bit floral from the strawberries, and the spices that are in this are really subtle. They just kind of round it out without giving you a big hit of Christmas spices. So yeah, this is definitely a keeper. And according to the comments on the original recipe, you can also make this with blueberries or raspberries instead of the strawberries. So lots of variations on this. Give this recipe a try, tribe. Thanks for watching, tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.